Mexico and stuff like that. And the killing, you got all the killing. They're not supplying money or stuff to stop all the killing within the United States, not just from Mexico, but what all the killing you have from the people in the United States that is legal. Right. And that's my comment. And it wasn't a disgrace that they turned the money, that they turned his emergency stuff down. They gave him money, had passed for to give him money at first from Jump Street. But he had so much backlash from people that have money.
All right, Bobby, thanks for your call. There, get a couple more calls in here. We have Alex calling from North Las Vegas, Nevada, independent line. Hi, Alex.
How you doing?
Pretty
Thanks
good.
for the call.
You bet.
I am totally for the wall. Why doesn't the country or the Democrats, who are never going to vote for anything that our president wants, why don't they listen to the professionals that know? DHS and ICE, they all say to a man that we need a border wall. And I agree, we should use other means to do that. But we definitely need the wall, and it's all about votes for the Democrats. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Alex, for the call. Another call here, Republican line, Bridgeton, Maine. Sam's calling. Hi, Sam.
Yeah, I'm totally disgusted with the Republicans that have voted against this. I'm totally for it. I think that we need the wall. I think the country should get behind the president and push to get a wall. And I think if these people want to come to this country, they should come legally. We don't need people coming in here that we don't know. This caused a lot of trouble. There's a lot of problems with the immigrants coming in illegally. I think the president's trying to do the best job he can, but I think the Republican Party better step up to the plate. I think I'm disgusted with the way the Republican Party's been operating.
All right, Sam, thanks for your thoughts. Just one more call here. We've got a border resident calling from Mission, Texas. Milda's with us. Hi, Milda.
Hi, how you doing? I have never been so upset with my Congressman Henry Cuellar, and I'm pleading to all of Texas, our region, to vote him out. He knows that we need the border wall. He took Pelosi to the wrong area. He should have brought her here to the McAllen Mission area, the Rio Grande, where the real problem is. I was born and raised here. I've been robbed a few times by illegal aliens. I've had accidents with illegal aliens. I almost lost my grandchild because my daughter was pregnant. The illegal alien was let scot-free. I see them at the grocery stores with food stamps. I have to watch what I spend because I do not qualify because I'm an American citizen. So I urge the Texas Lower Rio Grande to vote Henry Cuellar out.
And Milda weighing in there on House member. The Senate voting today 59-41, 12 Republicans joining Democrats in voting to terminate President Trump's national emergency declaration. Goes on to the president. He's expected to veto it. And already House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said that as soon as they return from next week's break on March 26th, she's planning to hold a vote to overturn any presidential veto. Of course, we'll keep you updated here on C-SPAN. Appreciate all your phone calls, and we'll be taking your calls again tomorrow morning on Washington Journal. For now, though, we'll take a look back, starting with the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell opening the floor this morning at 10 a.m. as they started their action ahead of the vote today.
The Senate will vote on a resolution related to the state of emergency the President has declared on our southern border. Let me first say that I support the President's decision, so I'll vote today to uphold it and reject this resolution of disapproval. But I want to begin where this whole discussion should begin. Beyond all the partisan rhetoric and denials of reality that we see from our friends across the aisle, just the facts of the matter. And the facts are not at all ambiguous. There's a clear border security and humanitarian crisis on the southern border of the United States of America. It was only last week that the President's top officials in the matter, Secretary Nielsen, CBP Commissioner McElwain, each came before Congress to once again lay all this out. The men charged with protecting our nation's borders didn't mince words ahead of last week's hearing. This is what he had to say. The system is well beyond capacity and remains at the breaking point. The system is well beyond capacity and remains at the breaking point. The Commissioner pointed out to our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee that the 76,000 attempted illegal crossings documented in February marked an 11-year high for that month, and based on CPB projections, by the middle of this month, that is tomorrow, apprehensions for fiscal 2009 will already be twice what they were in all of fiscal year 2017. And in front of the House Homeland Security Committee, the Secretary of Homeland Security elaborated by saying the following: our capacity is already severely strained, but these increases will overwhelm the system completely. Now, this is one of the President's senior advisors, a cabinet secretary, and she's telling members of Congress that the current situation is very much a crisis, one that requires immediate action. Over the past 5 years, CPB has recorded a 620% increase in apprehensions of family units at the U.S.-Mexico border. Last year's figure marked an all-time high. Research suggests upwards of 30% of women apprehended at the border report experiencing sexual assault during the journeys. Lately, a daily average of 56 individuals taken into CPB custody have required emergency medical care. So, Madam President, the men and women of the Border Patrol are brave. They are well trained, they are highly skilled, and they volunteered for a very challenging job. But today they are facing challenges that they're not fully equipped to overcome. It's no secret I take the Senate as an institution extremely seriously. I take the separation of powers extremely seriously. And I take Congress' prerogative over appropriations extremely seriously. But as I argued yesterday in the context of the Yemen resolution, the Senate should not be in the business of misusing specific resolutions to express opinions on more general matters. President Trump has not invoked some vague Article II authority or simply swept aside existing law, as President Obama did to establish his DACA policy. He has simply operated within existing law, the National Emergencies Act of 1976, to invoke a narrow set of authorities to reprogram a narrow set of funds. If Congress has grown uneasy with this new law, as many have, then we should amend it. If the 116th Congress regrets the degree of flexibility that the 94th Congress gave the executive, the 116th Congress has the ability to do something about it. I've suggested to the chair of the Homeland Security Committee that they examine how the law can be updated to reflect these concerns. I hope they can report bipartisan solutions through the regular order that the full Senate can actually take up. But let's not lose sight of the particular question that's before us later today. Whether the facts tell us there is a truly humanitarian and security crisis on our southern border, and whether the Senate, for some reason, feels that this particular emergency on our own border does not rise to the level of the 31 other national emergencies which are currently in effect. In my own view, these narrow questions are not especially difficult ones to answer. The President is operating within existing law, and the crisis on our border is all too real. So, I will vote to support the President's decision later today, and I would encourage our colleagues to do the same.
Today, Madam President, the Senate will vote on the resolution to terminate the President's declaration of a national emergency. This is not a normal vote. This is not a normal day, what we're doing here today. It's not your typical vote on an appropriations or authorization bill. It doesn't concern a nomination or an appointment. This will be a vote about the very nature of our Constitution, our separation of powers, how this government functions henceforth. The framers gave Congress the power of the purse in Article 1 of the Constitution. It's probably our greatest power. And now the President is claiming that power for himself under a guise of an emergency declaration to get around a Congress that repeatedly would not authorize his demand for a border wall. The President has not justified the emergency declaration. You'd think in a moment like this, when it's not a war, when it's not an immediate disease, that's when we've had other declarations, a disaster. They don't need an elaboration, but this one would. But the President hasn't done that. He simply said he didn't need to do this. That's amazing, folks, my colleagues. The President says he didn't need to do this, and yet he's declaring an emergency. It's a direct contradiction of his own words. Well, everyone knows the truth here. Democrats and Republicans both know the sad truth. The President did not declare an emergency. The President did not declare an emergency because there is one. He declared an emergency because he lost in Congress and wants to get around it. He's obsessed with showing strength, and he couldn't just abandon his pursuit of the border wall, so he had to trample on the Constitution to continue his fight. Well, that is not how this democracy is supposed to function. That is not how this democracy has functioned. I've never seen it. We're at a peak, out of anger, out of a desire to win the fight regardless of the consequences, that a president would do this. Nor has the President laid out where he plans to divert funds from, though we know it's going to be from our military, from the men and women serving us, and from the things they need. Senators who vote against this resolution this afternoon may be voting to gut funding for a military installation in their state, or a cut to military pay and military pensions. How could they do that? But most importantly, Madam President, President Trump has shown zero understanding of what his emergency portends for the separation of powers in our democracy. The President seems to regard the government, not just the Justice Department, as his own personal tool to do whatever he wants, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector. We've never had a president like this. We've had lots of presidents with lots of foibles, but none of them seem to equate their own ego with the entire functioning of the government of the United States, except this one. Well, we can't succumb to that. It's our job here in Congress to limit executive overreach, to defend our core powers, to prevent a president, any president, from ignoring the will of Congress every time it fails to align with the will of the president. That's what balance of powers is. That's what checks and balances is. That's what every one of us learned in second grade civics class. But all that teaching in the second grade civics class seems to be lost on so many of my Republican colleagues in blind obeisance to this president, no matter what the consequences. This is not an issue of the wall. It goes way beyond that. We've had our fights and disputes on the wall for several years here. However you feel about our policy on the southern border, however you feel about the president, senators should vote yes on the resolution to terminate the emergency declaration. This resolution is about more than this president. It's about the presidency, now and on into the future. It should not be difficult for any of my Republican colleagues to take this vote. Conservative principles would demand it, and some of the true conservatives like Mr. Lee yesterday, understood that logic. Conservatives have always feared an agglomeration of power in any branch of government, but particularly the executive. The conservative movement has been designed to reduce the powers of the federal government. That's why they're for lowering taxes so much. And all of a sudden, again, because President Trump simply wants it, they say, let's abandon those principles and vote to change fundamentally the way the balance of power works. Shame. If conservatism today is to mean anything, self-branded conservatives should vote to terminate the resolution. Deep-seated principles like that shouldn't take a back seat to the politics of the moment. They should not be abandoned just because the president shares the same party. Now, let me speak from the heart to my Republican colleagues. I know that President Trump is extremely popular among Republicans for many reasons. I know he commands the vast majority of the Republican Party. And I know that the president never shies away from threatening, bullying, or publicly castigating members of his own party if they refuse to do what he wants. So I realize this. This is a much more difficult vote for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to take than for those of us who are Democrats. But I would say to them, I would say to every Republican, there are times when loyalty to America, to our Constitution, to our principles, to what has made this country great, should lead members to rise to the occasion. I hope, I pray, this moment is one of those times. When members choose country over party, when members rise above politics for the sake of fidelity to our constitutional principles and to this great United States of America. In conclusion, Madam President, on this issue, in conclusion, this is not an everyday moment. This is not just about going along with this president or that one. This is a red-letter day in the history of how the United States government functions. The judgment of our founding fathers, the judgment of history, weighs upon this vote.
Madam President, Tennesseans ask me, is there really a crisis on the southern border? Do you support President Trump's border wall? And my answer to both questions is yes, I do. I've urged the president to build the 234 miles of border wall that he asked for in his January the 6th letter to the Senate, and to do that in the fastest possible way, with a minimum delay and legal challenge, by using the $5.7 billion already approved by Congress. But the president's emergency declaration to take an additional $3.6 billion that Congress has appropriated for military hospitals, for barracks, and for schools, including one at Fort Campbell, is inconsistent with the United States Constitution that I took an oath to support and to defend. Never before has a president asked for funding, the Congress has not provided it, and then the president has used the National Emergencies Act of 1976 to spend the money anyway. The problem with this is that after a revolutionary war against a king, our nation's founders gave to Congress, a Congress elected by the people, the power to approve all spending so that the president would not have too much power. This check on the executive is a source of our freedom. In addition, this precedent, or this declaration, is a dangerous precedent. Already, Democrat presidential candidates are saying they would declare emergencies to tear down the existing border wall, to take away guns, to stop oil exports, to shut down offshore drilling and other left-wing enterprises, all without the approval of Congress. I believe the crisis on our southern border is real. U.S. Customs and Border Patrol arrested more than 66,000 illegal aliens in February of 2019, the highest total in a single month since March 2009. In the last 2 years alone, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers have arrested 266,000 illegal aliens in the United States with criminal records. And each week, approximately 300 Americans die from heroin overdoses, of which nearly 90% come across the southern border. So during the last 25 years, Congress approved, and Presidents Obama, President Clinton, President George W. Bush, President George H.W. Bush built 654 miles of barrier along the 1,954-mile southern border. In 2013, the comprehensive immigration bill that received 68 Senate votes, including mine, included $40 billion for border security and enforcement. And last year, I voted for, and nearly every Democrat did, a bill that included $25 billion for border security. So one might ask, why is President Trump the only president not allowed to build more wall on the southern border? But in this case, as the Wall Street Journal said on March 12th, quote, the president doesn't need to invoke a national emergency to build his wall along the southern border, unquote. He has the money immediately available in other accounts already approved by Congress. And any appreciation for our structure of government means that no president should be able to use the National Emergencies Act to spend money that Congress refuses to provide. The late Justice Antonin Scalia, who is revered by constitutional conservatives, put it this way, quote, Justice Scalia said, every tin-horn dictator in the world today, every president for life has a Bill of Rights. That's not what makes us free. What has made us free, Justice Scalia said, is our Constitution. Think of the word Constitution, he said. It means structure. That's why America's framers debated not the Bill of Rights, but rather the structure of the federal government. The genius, Justice Scalia wrote, the genius of the American constitutional system is the dispersal of power. Once power is centralized in one person or one part of government, a Bill of Rights is just words on paper. That was Justice Scalia. I fault Democrats, Madam President, for not supporting President Trump's reasonable requests for more wall on the border after 25 years of approving physical barriers and border wall for 4 other presidents. But that is not an excuse to ignore the constitutional separation of powers, especially when the faster way to build the 234 more miles of border wall that the president has asked for is to use $5.7 billion already approved by Congress. I ask consent to include, following my remarks, the editorial from the Wall Street Journal dated March 12th of this month.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Madam President, for the recognition, and great to be joined on the floor by Senator Collins, who is going to speak after I am and is going to stand up for the Constitution. And I very much appreciate Senator Lamar Alexander's comments also. He's a real student of the Constitution, and I respect very much the conclusion he's come up with here today. exercise their own separate powers. And they made sure that no one branch, no one person could exercise too much power, especially over the use of taxpayer money. The founders gave to Congress the power of the purse, one of our most fundamental powers. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution could not be more clear. Quote, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law." Congress holds the power to spend taxpayer money, not the President. It is our job to make sure that spending decisions have widespread public support and are not the product of an extreme minority, much less one man or one woman. We all know that the President wants a wall. We just had a major debate about border security funding. The President shut down the government for 35 days because Congress refused his wall request. Eventually he relented, but now he's declared an emergency to simply try and take the money that he couldn't get from the appropriations process. He said, and I quote, "I don't even have to do this," end quote. He flaunted the fact that this is not a real emergency. The President is testing the limits of executive power. The question before the Senate today is, are we going to let this happen? Or are we going to open Pandora's box? What about Article 1 of the Constitution? What about the 35-day government shutdown? What about presidential budget requests? And what about the Appropriations Committee? Are we really going to let a president raid taxpayer money after Congress denies the request? The opposition to this power grab is bipartisan, as it should be. Among the American people, the numbers are overwhelming. Madam President, almost 70% of the American people oppose the President's emergency declaration to raid taxpayer money for the wall. That's almost 70%. My fellow senators, it's time for the Senate to do its job. It's time for us to assert our authority over the purse. It's time for us to honor our oath of office. Every senator should vote yes on the resolution to terminate the President's emergency declaration. And I want to thank my co-sponsors in this effort. I mentioned Senator Collins earlier, who's on the floor with me and will speak after me, Senator Murkowski, Senator Shaheen. I know that Senator Collins is on the floor again to urge us to do the right thing, to stand up for Congress's authority. This vote is historic. The Constitution's principle of separation of powers is at stake. If the Senate enables the President to hijack our power to appropriate, history will not remember us fondly. This vote is not about the wisdom of building a wall along the border. This vote is not about party. This vote is about whether we will let any president trample on the Constitution, whether we will sit by and let the President take away our constitutional authority to appropriate. I rise today hopeful that my Republican colleagues will speak up. In addition to Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski, Senator Tillis stated firmly in a recent opinion piece, "I support Trump's vision on border security, but I would vote against the emergency." Why does he say he would vote against the emergency declaration? Because he says, and I quote from Senator Tillis here, "As a senator, I cannot justify providing the executive with more ways to bypass Congress." Former Governor Kasich authored an opinion piece recently titled, "It's time for Republicans in the Congress to put country over party." He states, "Let's be clear. This vote is not about the situation at the border. It's about an executive power grab, and above all, congressional respect for the democratic process." And I couldn't agree more with Governor Kasich. And I would like to enter the full pieces by Senator Tillis and Governor Kasich in the record, and would ask consent to do that, Madam President.
Without objection.
Thank you. To get this wall money, the President caused the longest government shutdown in the history of our nation. The shutdown caused hardship for millions of federal employees and lasting pain for thousands of federal contractors, not to mention the millions of Americans who were denied services for 35 days, services they paid for with their tax dollars. I visited with New Mexicans hurt by the shutdown, and it was very, very painful to hear their stories. In the end, Congress decided on a bipartisan basis not to spend the $5.7 billion the President demanded for his wall. He got $1.3 billion. I didn't want to see that much, and I wanted to see more restrictions as to specifically what it was going to be spent for. But it was a hard-fought compromise, and a deal's a deal. Congress's determination should have ended the debate for this fiscal year, the year that we're in. And now the President is asking Congress for $8.6 billion for the border wall next year. That is his prerogative. But make no mistake, it is not only Congress's prerogative, it is Congress's constitutional responsibility to decide if he gets that money. As the old saying goes, the President proposes and Congress disposes. President Trump is being treated no differently than all previous presidents. That is how our constitutional system works, or at least how it's supposed to work. The President's emergency declaration is an end run around Congress, plain and simple. If any Democratic president issued an emergency declaration like this, say for climate change or gun safety funding, Republicans in this body would scream bloody murder and vote to disapprove. Now, I'm on record that climate change is one of the most pressing issues on our planet, and I'm on record that gun violence is a national crisis. But I have voted for and proposed actual legislation on these topics, as our system is supposed to work. No previous president has used the National Emergency Act to bypass the appropriations process like this. Our Constitution, the rule of law, separation of powers, all of these rise far above the day-to-day controversies like the President's border wall. On a practical note, the President wants to take real money away from real military construction projects that will have a real impact on national security. Military construction projects that have been vetted through years of scrutiny, through the military, through numerous congressional committees in Congress, projects deemed essential to the national security, projects all across the nation in your states now at risk. We have a long list of military construction projects threatened by the President, yet he has not bothered to tell us which projects will be cut to build his wall. Will he raise $793 million to rebuild Camp Lejeune in North Carolina after the devastation from Hurricane Florence? Will he steal up to $800 million for Navy ship maintenance to make sure that accidents like what happened to the USS McCain and USS Fitzgerald never happen again? Will he raid $125 million from my home state of New Mexico for Holloman Air Force Base to develop unmanned aerial vehicles to track terrorists, and for White Sands Missile Range to build a badly needed information systems facility? The answer is we don't know. But these critical projects in all of our states are at risk. We each need to think about our states and the people we were sent here to represent. I am from one of the 4 states that border Mexico, one of the 4 states that would be the most directly impacted by any border wall. And I'm here to tell you there is no national security emergency along my state's border with Mexico. What is happening at our border does not justify the use of this authority. New Mexico's border communities are flourishing with economic, cultural, and educational activity. Border communities are as safe or safer than others in the interior. This is not a partisan view along the border. Republican Will Hurd represents more than 500 miles of the Texas border with Mexico. He not only believes the President's emergency declaration is unconstitutional, he thinks the President's wall is, quote, the most expensive and least effective way to do border security. But again, whether you support or oppose the border wall is not an issue. What is at issue is our oath to support and defend the Constitution, whether any president can toss Congress aside and raid critical funds at will. We have an opportunity to stand up to an unconstitutional power grab. I urge everyone in this chamber to seize that opportunity. And with this, I would yield to Senator Collins, who from the beginning has worked with me, and we have our resolution in, and we are working hard to make sure that we stand up to the Constitution. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, later today, the Senate will make a significant decision with implications for our constitutional system of government. We will vote on a resolution to reverse the President's ill-advised national emergency declaration that funds the construction of a border wall using money that Congress has appropriated and the President has signed into law for other purposes such as military construction. I want to thank Senator Udall, the senator from New Mexico, for working together with me. We introduced a companion resolution to overturn the President's declaration, and I commend Senator Udall for his leadership. By declaring a national emergency, the President's action comes into direct conflict with Congress's authority to determine the appropriation of funds, a power vested in Congress by the framers of our Constitution in Article 1, Section 9. That is why this issue is not about strengthening our border security, a goal that I support and have voted to advance. Rather, Mr. President, it is a solemn occasion involving whether or not this body will stand up for its institutional prerogatives and will support the separation of powers enshrined in our Constitution. Throughout our history, the courts have consistently held that, quote, only Congress is empowered by the Constitution to adopt laws directing monies to be spent from the U.S. Treasury, end quote. For the past 65 years, the courts have determined the boundaries of presidential authority vis-a-vis Congress under the doctrine of Youngstown Steel, Sheet and Tubing, the 1952 Supreme Court case which reversed President Truman's seizure of U.S. steel companies during the Korean War. As Justice Robert Jackson explained in his profoundly influential concurrence in that case, the question of whether a president's actions are constitutionally valid should be determined by examining the source of the president's authority. And in this concurrence, the justice goes through 3 scenarios in which he assesses the president's power. According to Justice Jackson, when acts taken by the president are against the express or implied will of Congress, the president's power is at its lowest ebb. Mr. President, President Trump's declaration clearly falls in that category. Now, the President rests his declaration on the National Emergencies Act, and that act fails to define precisely what constitutes an emergency. But there is a common sense rule that we can apply. It is a 5-part test that was used by the Office of Management and Budget under former President George Herbert Walker Bush to determine whether or not requested funding merited an emergency designation under our budget rules. Under that test, a spending request was designated as an emergency only if the need for spending met a 5-part test. It had to be necessary, sudden, urgent, unforeseen, and not permanent. Now, whether or not one agrees with President Trump that more should be done to secure our southern border, and I do agree with him on that goal, his decision to fund a border wall through a national emergency declaration would never pass all of this 5-part test. Another concern that I have with the President's declaration is that it shifts funding away from critical military construction projects. We don't know which ones. We've not been able to get a list. But this could have very real national security implications. And again, I would note that the Military Construction Appropriations Bill incorporated projects recommended by the President and his Department of Defense, was passed by both bodies and signed into law by the President. Let me emphasize once again that the question presented by this resolution is not whether you're for a border wall or against a border wall. It is not whether you believe that border security should be strengthened or whether it is sufficient. It is not whether or not we support or oppose President Trump. Rather, the question is a far more fundamental and significant one. The question is this: do we want the executive branch, now or in the future, to hold the power of the purse, a power that the framers deliberately entrusted to Congress? We must stand up and defend Congress's institutional powers as the framers intended that we would, even when doing so is inconvenient or goes against the outcome that we might prefer. I urge my colleagues to support the resolution of disapproval and our Constitution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, this is a debate worth happening. I appreciate the comments from my New England neighbor. It is an important matter for us to consider. When President Trump declared a national emergency, he cited a crisis at the southern border, but it's become more and more evident he did it for only one reason: to do an end run around Congress and the Appropriations Committee and use taxpayer money to build a wall on the southern border that Congress has refused to fund. For 3 years, he failed to convince a Congress, a Republican-controlled Senate, a Republican-controlled House, that his wall was a good idea. For 3 years, he requested that Congress fund his cynical campaign promise to build, quote, big, beautiful, close quote, wall on the southern border. And for 3 years, the Republican-controlled Congress refused. And so, even when his own party controlled both chambers of Congress, he couldn't convince enough members that it was a good idea. And certainly nobody accepted his pledge that Mexico would pay for the wall. We all knew the U.S. taxpayers would have to pay for it. So instead of accepting that we live in a democracy and he's not a monarch, instead of accepting that in a democracy there are two other co-equal branches of government that can constrain his actions, the President has decided to ignore the Constitution and the will of Congress and go it alone. Now, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, as we all know, established that Congress, and actually Congress alone, has the power of the purse. Congress' exclusive power over our government's spending priorities is one of the most critical checks and balances in our constitutional system. Anybody who goes back and reads the history of the founding of this country and hear the debate and hear what George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, everybody else said, we know that from the founding of this country, and the reason we're the oldest existing democracy currently in the world is that we believed in the checks and balances. The President, of course, can propose funding for whatever projects he wants, but it's the job of Congress to decide where to invest the Americans' people hard-earned tax dollars. And in a democracy, as every president from George Washington to now is supposed to respect those decisions. But after not getting what he wanted, this president has invoked the National Emergencies Act. He's stretching the powers given to him in that act beyond all recognition. He's declared a national emergency on the southern border. But he's not responding to a national emergency. There's no crisis on our southern border requiring such extreme action. What kind of a national emergency is declared only after you lose a 3-year funding fight with members of your own party? What kind of national emergency is resolved, this national emergency, by a vaguely defined multi-year construction project? Truth is clear, he's trying to use this authority for a political end. Now, when Congress enacted the National Emergencies Act of 1976, it conveyed certain powers to the President to use in the event of a true emergency that required quick action, and it assumed, and I remember I was here during the debate, and there was a Republican president, that whoever sat in the Oval Office would have enough respect for the office and the power being conveyed not to abuse it. We felt, those of us in the Senate at that time, that whether it was a Republican or Democratic president, they would not abuse the power. Well, President Trump has failed that test. Presidential emergency powers should only be invoked in a true time of crisis. It's an abuse of power to invoke these authorities just because he couldn't do what he wanted any other way. But let's see what he would do if he has these powers. Now he wants to raise money meant for military housing, military base improvements, pay for his wall. This almost in the same week we see in the news so much of military housing is infested by mold, by rats, by asbestos, by all these other problems. He's going to take the money that would make this housing safe for the men and women in our military to pay for his wall. Or is he going to take money from Camp Lejeune that was hit by Hurricane Florence and badly, badly damaged? I know Camp Lejeune. My son, when he was in the Marines, spent time there. Or is he going to take it from Tyndall Air Force Base, which was flattened by Hurricane Michael? What about money for schools for military families, like the school at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, or a child development center at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland? Or essential training facilities that would ensure military readiness, like a special operations training facility at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which I have visited. You know, Congress chose to fund these projects over an ineffectual, wasteful wall. Congress had to decide, where does the money go? We felt these things, to help our military be in better shape, made far more sense than the wall. Congress used its constitutional power, let me emphasize that, its constitutional power of the purse to set priorities, how we're going to invest the American people's hard-earned tax dollars. Now, the president is trying to label opponents of his action as weak on border security or weak on crime. That's nonsense. I don't know any member of the Senate of either party who doesn't believe in border security or is in favor of crime. But let's see what he asked for. Instead of border security, he wanted $5.7 billion for the wall. Instead, Congress approved a border security package, money for fencing along with technology at between the ports of entry and additional personnel. That's real border security, not a political stunt. Now the president is saying, well, thank you for your views, thank you for following your constitutional power, but I'm still going to do it my way. Now, where's it going to stop? And the fact that it is a political game has shown that when this Congress passed overwhelmingly $1.6 billion for border security, the president vetoed that. And then after closing the government for 35 days, costing the taxpayers billions and billions and billions of dollars for nothing, he signed a bill that did not give him the $1.6 billion that he vetoed, but gave him $1.3 billion, and that he signed. If anybody thinks this is just games playing, that states it. Over the past 2 years, we've seen the erosion of our institutional checks and balances in the face of creeping authoritarianism. The time has come for the Congress and members of the president's own party to take a stand. Congress simply cannot afford to remain silent in the face of such an unprecedented violation of the separation of powers. Now, I understand that Senator Lee has introduced a bill to reform the National Emergencies Act. I appreciate the thought he's put into this issue, and I'm certainly going to review his legislation with an open mind, but make no mistake, legislation to fix future abuses of this law, that doesn't address the abuse we have happening right now. His bill does not address the fact that this president is trying to do an end run around Congress, an end run around both Democrats and Republicans alike, and cynically using an emergency declaration to fund a request that we had voted on and did not approve. We must send a message to the president that this is unacceptable. This is not something that nobody's ever voted on. We have voted on this matter. And under the Constitution, that is what is supposed to carry the day. And I hope my Republican friends take a moment to take stock of where we are. President Trump's going to be but a moment in our nation's history. But the Constitution should control our history, no matter who is president. And for the sake of appeasing a man who made a foolish campaign promise that was never grounded in reality, won't they stand up for the institution which they serve? For the sake of appeasing a president who detests any limits or checks on his authority, even those in the Constitution, will they forever diminish the role of Congress as a co-equal branch of government? Now is the time for country over party. And I'll vote aye on the joint resolution of disapproval. I urge all senators to do the same.
We have reached a moment of crisis. But it's not a constitutional crisis. It's a crisis on the border, a crisis of American sovereignty. When hundreds of thousands of foreigners arrive at the southern border and demand entry, that's not migration. That's an emergency and a threat to our sovereignty. And the stories speak for themselves. Last Thursday, an American citizen named Rocio Aldurate was shot to death on a bridge over the Mexican border near McAllen, Texas. Early reports suggest that Rocio was caught in a shootout between cartel gunmen and Mexican police. But whatever the case turns out to be, Rocio has perished, the latest American victim of lawlessness at our border. Since last October, the Border Patrol agents have apprehended more than 260,000 illegal aliens at the border, a surge of 90%, almost double from the previous year. For the most part, these aren't young men coming for work, as is so often the case in the past, but rather Central Americans gaming our generous asylum laws. Instead of running away from the Border Patrol, these illegal aliens run to it so they can be captured and released into the country with notice to appear in court, which they hardly ever do. And thanks to stupid laws and activist judges, illegal aliens are even using little kids as legal force fields, because being detained with a minor increases their odds of being held in America, not turned around and sent home. As a result, we see all the horrors of the human smuggling trade at the border today. Women and girls are sexually assaulted at horrific rates. Hundreds die in the desert each year of thirst and exhaustion. Infectious diseases we'd all but eradicated with vaccines are appearing again in border communities. ICE health officials have found 236 confirmed or probable cases of mumps among detainees in the past year, after reporting 0 cases for the previous 2 years. This surge of illegal aliens is swamping law enforcement's ability to do its job. Overwhelmed, that's the word we hear so often from agents. And Border Patrol Commissioner Kevin McAleenan says this is clearly both a border security and a humanitarian crisis. The consequences of this crisis stretch far beyond the border, sometimes thousands of miles away. An American, one of 192 every day, dies of a drug overdose. The poison in his veins flowed across the Mexican border. A brave police officer and father, Corporal Ronell Singh of California, is shot dead the day after Christmas. His killer snuck in the country illegally. We have failed to protect our border, as any sovereign nation must, and our people are dying because of it. The President has declared a national emergency because of this crisis. Yet the administration's sensible, long overdue efforts to secure the border have been met only by howls of outrage from the Democratic Party and its media wing. Judging from their reaction, you'd think the real emergency wasn't our lawless border, but any genuine effort to secure it. The minority leader called the President's emergency declaration a lawless act that showed naked contempt for the rule of law. Other members of the self-styled resistance have compared the President to Hitler. Curious, overheated claims, I have to say. To be lawless, after all, one must act outside the law. Yet the President's critics don't even bother making that case, probably because they don't have much of one to make. The President isn't purporting to invoke his inherent executive powers under Article 2 of our Constitution. He doesn't even claim to defend his constitutional prerogatives from legislative encroachment. On the contrary, he is only exercising the statutory authority delegated to him by us, by this very body, the United States Congress. More than half of the $8.1 billion the President is using to build the wall and secure the border comes from non-emergency statutes passed by Congress. The remainder comes from an explicit delegation of various powers to the President in the event of a national emergency, just like the one that the President has declared, which we also delegated him the authority to do. I should add that the National Emergencies Act passed nearly unanimously, with only 5 no votes in the House. Now, I'm sympathetic to arguments that the National Emergencies Act is too broad and gives the executive branch too much power. That's a reasonable debate to have. Believe me, Congress has ceded too much power to the executive for more than a century, expanding an administrative state that increasingly deprives our people of a meaningful say in their government. So I invite my Democratic colleagues to reconsider the wisdom of this path. Maybe we can also reform the EPA. Perhaps we could require up or down votes in Congress to approve big regulations so the politicians around here could show some accountability for once. I'm ready to have those debates. Believe me, I'm ready. But in the meantime, don't pretend that we didn't delegate all these powers or that it's lawless for the executive to use the laws that we pass just because you deplore him. If you want to see lawless executive action, by the way, you can look instead to the last administration. President Obama purported to give millions of illegal aliens legal status and work permits in clear violations of statutes passed by this Congress. And he expressly defied our ban on bailout payments from the Obamacare slush fund to big health insurance companies. Strange how I don't recall the self-styled resistance manning the ramparts and rushing to the Ninth Circuit back then. In fact, I only recall a lot of congressional fanboys of a president using the pen and phone to encroach on our constitutional prerogatives. Now, I've also heard from some senators who admit that the president is acting lawfully, but who worry about the slippery slope of executive power. I respect this view. Our system of separated powers calls on each branch to jealously protect its own powers. But one can ski to the bottom of the slippery slope pretty fast. Today, a Republican declares a national emergency on the border. Tomorrow, a Democrat, or who knows these days, maybe a socialist, declares a gun violence emergency to confiscate guns, or a climate change emergency to shut down coal-fired power plants. Now, I'll acknowledge it doesn't take much to imagine such abuses by a future liberal president, especially with the gang they've got running today. But that's precisely what such actions would be, abuses. What the law says matters here. We have delegated to the executive the power to enforce the nation's immigration laws, including by emergency declaration. We have not delegated to the executive the power to confiscate guns, close power plants, or any of the other common entrants in the parade of horribles on the slippery slope. That's the difference between lawful and lawless government, and that's the case here. Now, still others claim that the crisis on the border isn't bad enough to call a national emergency. Some have gone so far as to deride it as a fake emergency. Well, if killings and caravans and cartels out at the border are a fake emergency, I'd really hate to see a genuine emergency. But let's suppose we take their claim seriously. We at least ought to be able to compare the crisis at the border to past national emergencies to see how they all stack up. Right now, there are 32 national emergencies in effect. 32 national emergencies. Among them is a national emergency related to election fraud in Belarus. Another is in response to the breakdown of the rule of law in Lebanon. A third is in response to a failed coup in Burundi. I don't deny those are all genuine problems or that an American response may well be warranted. Far from it. But I doubt many Americans would put them ahead of a serial violation of our sovereign border by millions of foreigners. If the Belarusians warrant an emergency declaration, then surely Americans do too when we face a crisis at our southern border. Democrats used to take border security seriously. But in elite society these days, border security is a bad word. And wall is practically a four-letter word. Unless it's the walls that protect the rich and the powerful and the politically connected from a dangerous world. Yet look in the news. The Democrats' newest presidential aspirant, Robert Francis O'Rourke, a former congressman and failed Senate candidate, has gone so far to suggest tearing down existing barriers at the southern border, which I'm sure thrilled all the good people in El Paso who don't live in a world of private planes and security details. Regrettably, the Democrats' hostility to border security couldn't come at a worse time for our country, because there is indeed a crisis at the border, and we ought to be addressing it. We could be spending this valuable legislative time to tighten up our asylum laws or crack down on employers who exploit illegal aliens instead of hiring American workers, or ramp up drug enforcement. Instead, we're debating whether a crisis at our southern border can be called an emergency. Instead of solving a problem, we're trying to spin it. So I have a simple suggestion for my colleagues. If you're genuinely alarmed by the President's invocation of the very emergency powers we delegated to him, instead of furrowing your brows and tugging your chins and gravely citing Youngstown's sheet, let's tackle this emergency declaration by making it unnecessary. Let's get to the root of the problem and secure our border once and for all. No more border crisis, no more emergency. It's as simple as that.
Senator from Virginia.
Madam President, I rise, as colleagues of mine have earlier today, to talk about the President's emergency declaration. Before I do, I will just say that this declaration deals with budgetary matters. At the end of the day, whether the President should be able to take $6.1 billion this year and possibly more in future years from the Pentagon's budget to deal with a non-budgetary emergency. And I just want to acknowledge that my budget staffer, my right hand on all federal budget matters for the last 6.5 years, Ron Storog, today is his last day, and I'm really going to miss him. So I'll start there. I'm really going to miss Ron, who's done such a good job. And my only good feeling about it is he's staying right here in the Senate and moving to work with the senior senator from Maryland. I want to talk about the declaration and urge my colleagues to vote to reject what I believe is the President's unwise use of his power to raid the Pentagon's budget. Is there an emergency at the border? There's a serious issue at the border, a whole series of serious issues, both negative but also positive. Trade happens across all the borders of the country. But all the testimony before the Armed Services Committee where I sit says there's no military emergency at the border. We heard testimony from General O'Shaughnessy, who is the commander of what we call NORTHCOM, everything in the Americas north of the Mexico's southern border. And General O'Shaughnessy said there's no military emergency at the border between the United States and Mexico. And we've heard the same testimony this morning from Defense Secretary Shanahan and the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford. So there's no military emergency at the border. And compared to other significant challenges that we deal with, 70,000 drug overdose deaths a year, climate change, 40,000 deaths a year from gun violence, including both homicides and suicide, homelessness, lack of medical care, military housing, it's hard to see why the border issue would be an emergency that would rise to the top of any list. I can certainly assert this: there are much higher priorities for Virginians. But while we could argue about whether it's an emergency, one thing I think is pretty clear: it's inarguably a presidential power grab. The president is unhappy with congressional appropriations for the border, so he's declaring an emergency to take $6.1 billion this year and possibly more in future years from the Pentagon's budget. And this will establish a very dangerous precedent. First, let's focus on the president being unhappy. For all of this president's tenure up till the 3rd of January, he had 2 Republican houses. There were 2 Republican houses and a Republican president. Why should he be unhappy with the budget? He would have had the ability to convince Republican majorities to do what he wanted, but he could not. And so he is unhappy with what Congress, the appropriating branch, has put on the table. We put billions of dollars on the table for the border, but he's unhappy with it, and so now he's going to declare an emergency. It raises 2 important questions. Can a president just declare an emergency every time he's unhappy that Congress doesn't accept his budgetary proposals? And second, can the president use the declaration of a non-military emergency to just tap a spigot into the Pentagon's budget? Because that's exactly what President Trump is trying to do in this case. The president has declared an emergency that all agree is a non-military emergency. The president has said, I want to take $6.1 billion to deal with this emergency from the Pentagon's budget. He wants to take $3.6 billion from military construction. Military construction are the funds that we use to build facilities on our military bases across the United States and across the world, or to rebuild facilities like the air base at Fort Tyndall or big sections of Camp Lejeune that were hit in hurricanes last year. That's what the MILCON budget is supposed to do. I toured this morning, Madam President, Fort Belvoir to visit with Army families living on Fort Belvoir in Fairfax County, Virginia, who were sharing with me atrocious stories of the conditions of the housing that they're living in. Atrocious stories, rodent infestation, black mold, lead and asbestos. I drove by one military house on Fort Belvoir that had a big warning sign on the door, poison. Poison. You could not enter it because of efforts at asbestos and lead remediation. The families told me about the poor physical conditions of their properties. They told me about the fact that they couldn't get a response when they were trying to get help. And then they told me tragically about the illness of their children, hospitalizations, having to move out of their homes and apartments. One mother of a 10-year-old talked about the fact that her 10-year-old daughter, because of mold in her military housing unit, missed 45 days of school in the last school year. That's 1/4 of the school year that she had to be absent because of the poor physical conditions of military housing. The MILCON budget is there to deal with issues like this, and yet the president wants to take $3.5 billion out of the MILCON budget, $3.6 billion out of the MILCON budget. The president wants to take $2.5 billion out of drug interdiction budget within the Department of Defense. Press reports suggest that that account only has about $85 million available, so what they would need to do is cannibalize other accounts to fill up that account to $2.5 billion to take that. Those are the funds, important funds, military construction and drug interdiction that the president is proposing to raid. And I think it's important to notice this. The president's emergency declaration is not just about tapping the budget this year for $6.1 billion. Earlier today, I asked Secretary Shanahan in an Armed Services hearing, doesn't this emergency declaration last until the president declares it's over? If we don't rebut the emergency, it is not just fiscal year 19, it's fiscal year 20 or 21. It will enable the president to tap a spigot into the MILCON budget and draw out monies this year, next year, and in future years. So it's $6.1 billion that he's asking for this year. But unless Congress asserts its Article I power to say that, no, we're the appropriator, we're basically allowing the president to tap into this fund in perpetuity, thereby affecting important military construction priorities that would be good for the military families in our nation's defense. Which military construction projects might be compromised by the president's use of these dollars, this $6.1 billion? When the president declared the emergency, I wrote a letter to Secretary Shanahan on February 15th and said, Can you give us the list of the projects that will be compromised by this $6.1 billion raid on the Pentagon's budget? And I have not received a response. That was 27 days ago. But this morning, Secretary Shanahan, before the committee, was asked, why haven't we received a list? If the president wants to take $6.1 billion out of the Pentagon's budget, give us a list of the potential projects that could be affected. I wrote a letter on the 15th. SASC staffers have been reaching out to the Pentagon. If you don't know precisely the projects, give us the universe, all unobligated MILCON projects that are on your priority list that could possibly be affected. Mr. President, today, Secretary Shanahan, after not responding to the requests, said, I'll send you a list at the end of the day. I'll send you a list basically after you vote this afternoon. The vote that we will be casting this afternoon is about whether the president should be able to raid the Pentagon's budget for $6.1 billion. We've been asking for a month what projects might be affected, and they are proposing now to give us an answer to the question after the vote. They've had the list from the very day we asked them. They keep a list every day about unobligated MILCON projects, but the service secretaries have not been allowed to share those lists with Congress until the Secretary of Defense allows them to, and he's going to allow us to see it today. Everybody is voting to cannibalize the Pentagon's budget to the tune of $6.1 billion. Every senator should be interested in what projects might be affected in their own states necessary to the nation's defense before they vote to give the president this power. In conclusion, Mr. President, I hope today we will stand up against the president's power grab. We shouldn't let the president tap a spigot into the Pentagon budget to deal with an emergency that all have agreed is a non-military emergency. We shouldn't let him tap a spigot that is not just for this budgetary year, but for future fiscal years as well, which is the effect of the vote today. We're the Article I branch, and under that section of the Constitution, we set spending priorities. The president should not be able to overturn the spending priorities that we have established in our appropriations bills because he's unhappy with our work product and raid the Pentagon's budget without telling us where the monies will come from. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to visit a little bit about the emergency declaration by the President, which is a bad idea. I think everybody in this body knows it's a bad idea, and we'll see how many people vote to override that bad idea. And it's a bad idea for a number of reasons. The President says it's for this country's safety, but he's robbing from our military to build a wall on the southern border, which I might add, most of the money that we allocated last fiscal year is still there, $1.3 billion, plus the $1.375 billion that was authorized by the conference committee, which was a group of Democrats and Republicans from the House and the Senate, passed by both bodies, which he received and said, I don't like it, and declared an emergency declaration. So, look, Montana is no stranger to military service. We are home to the second most veterans per capita of any state in the country. Every time our nation is at need, Montanans step up the plate and they answer the call to serve. And that is why today I rise to fight back against the President's declaration that we'll be shortchanging our troops in favor of a campaign promise to build a wall that he said Mexico would pay for. The President's plan to raid our military resources would directly hurt Montana's military community and its men and women that are in uniform. The heart of the Air Force's Global Strike Command is located in Great Falls, Montana, Malmstrom Air Force Base. The 341st Missile Wing at Malmstrom is a critical component in our nation's nuclear triad. It is a great deterrent against adversaries who would do us harm, and as President Kennedy said, it is our ace in the hole.
Over the past few years, I've been fighting to secure the military construction dollars on the Appropriations Committee to meet the needs of Malmstrom Air Force Base. I led a bipartisan effort to deliver more than $19 million to construct a new tactical response alert facility. That facility was a top priority for Malmstrom because the current facility is old. It's laden with asbestos and lead paint, and it has complicated efforts to secure the base's missile sites. Also helped secure some $14.6 million for construction of a missile maintenance facility, missile maintenance dispatch facility. This facility will allow the base to more properly and efficiently store critical components and equipment for the missile field, and to retrofit its hangars so that we can ultimately house the replacement fleet for its Vietnam-era Hueys, which should be replaced in the next couple years. Unfortunately, these construction facilities, the construction of these and many others around the country, are at risk by the President's decision. More alarmingly, Malmstrom is in critical need of a weapons generation facility, and I've been fighting for years to ensure that this project would be included among the Air Force's top military construction priorities. Earlier this week, just yesterday, the Secretary of the Air Force confirmed that funding for the facility has been included in the FY 2020 Air Force budget request. This investment represents a significant step forward for Malmstrom and for the Air Force and for our national security. It's important because this is where ICBM warheads are maintained and stored. As a result of the deterioration of this facility, airmen and missileers must confront numerous safety and security challenges while carrying out their mission every day. But now, we have to tell them that this critical project, which the Air Force has said they desperately need, and which they do desperately need, could very well get kicked down the road and kicked down the list of priorities because the President would rather spend billions of the military construction money on construction of his wall. The same is true for other critical infrastructure investments at Malmstrom, including a new security forces compound. But the President doesn't care. He's more interested in robbing taxpayer funds to build an unnecessary wall on the southern border. Congress has rejected the President's request on a bipartisan basis, and his defiance of that rejection comes at the expense of my state's defense installations. Great Falls is also home to the Montana Air National Guard. My older brother was in the Air Guard for 35 years, and I have seen their work up close. Since we entered the Middle East conflict 17 years ago, this country has used the Guard like never before. They've asked a lot of our citizen soldiers and airmen, and they have always delivered. Whether that was deploying to war, fighting against wildfires, or saving families from natural disasters. In Montana, they have asked for little in return, but they have asked for the construction of a new aircraft apron to park and store the Guard's C-130 fleet. So once again, we got to work. We secured the money, $9 million, to make sure that our C-130s will stay in good shape for years to come. Max Baucus and I fought hard to bring those C-130s to Montana, and that is why I'm so outraged that the President's emergency declaration puts this funding at risk. I know that nobody in this body takes the decision of sending young men and women to war lightly, but when those difficult decisions are made, we better deploy them with the best and the safest equipment. The debate today is clear. A vote against the President's disaster declaration is a vote to protect our co-equal branches of government, our system of checks and balances, our Constitution. And a vote for the President's power grab is a vote for federal overreach and a violation of our oath of office. I hope my colleagues who vote for this plan are on the first plane back home to explain to their constituents why they're shirking their basic duties. Explain to communities, of which there are many like Great Falls, Montana, why they're ripping those investments out of their town and out of our military. And explain to our future leaders why it's okay to follow the Constitution only when it's expedient. This disaster declaration undermines the bipartisan work that Republicans and Democrats have done to rebuild our military. It sets a dangerous precedent that no doubt will be abused by future presidents. And everybody in this body knows that. We have an option here. We have the ability to stand with our troops, stand with the Constitution, and reject this declaration. It's critically important. If we're going to have a strong military, and I think we decided last Congress to make investments into our military that were much needed, and now the President's pulling those dollars out. It's nothing short of ridiculous. I yield the floor.
Madam President, when President Trump declared a national emergency over the crisis along our southern border, it was immediately met with expressions of concern, some, in my view, illegitimate, others quite legitimate. As I've said in the past, I'll repeat again, what we are doing here today is no one's first choice, but it's useful to recall how we find ourselves at this point today. Of course, when it comes to funding, when it comes to appropriations, Congress holds the purse. That's why each year Congress receives the President's budget request for the upcoming fiscal year, just as we did earlier this week. But even though in the President's budget he outlines his priorities, my experience here in the Senate is most presidential budgets, while they are an expression of the President's priorities, are dead on arrival. It then falls to us in the Senate and the House to look at his request and to work on a compromise budget and appropriations process and fund the operations of the federal government. This process is arduous, it's time-consuming, and it's often frustrating, but it's the way the system is supposed to work. As all Americans can attest, what we've seen over the last few months looks like something very different. The refusal of Democrats in the House and the Senate to engage in negotiations on border security funding has led us to a 35-day government shutdown. Despite the clear message from border security experts, despite seeing the humanitarian crisis at the border described by President Obama in 2014 get many times worse, our Democratic colleagues decided to play politics instead of dealing with the problem. We heard the Speaker of the House call border barriers immoral. The minority leader here in the Senate said there would be no additional money for physical barriers along the border. But they know, just like I know, that back in 2006 and 2008, the Secure Fence Act was passed with broad bipartisan support, including support from then Senator Barack Obama, then Senator Hillary Clinton, and Senator Chuck Schumer, currently the Democratic leader in the Senate, who now feels like this president should not get any additional money to fund border security measures that the president believes are an important response to the crisis we see at the border. My preference would be for the normal appropriations process to be used. But when your negotiating partners refuse to take a seat at the table, normal goes out the window. Our colleagues across the aisle left the president with few options to fund what he believed were so important for the nation's security. And that's what led us to this situation. Enter the 1986 legislation, the National Emergencies Act. So what the president did is he asked his lawyers to look at what other authority under congressionally passed laws signed by previous presidents might I have to access additional funds. And his lawyers pointed to the 1976 National Emergencies Act, which have granted presidents since that time broad powers to reprogram funding previously appropriated by Congress. So this idea that somehow this is an unconstitutional act by this president is simply wrong. Congress has given the president this authority. Now, they may regret it today, or they may disagree that this is an emergency, or they may disagree with the way the president wants to spend the money to secure the border. But clearly, the president is using authorities that Congress has previously granted, not just to him, but to all presidents since 1976. But as my father liked to remind me growing up, one of the things he always told me is hindsight is always 20/20. Our predecessors did not anticipate the fights we would be having today, which are largely contrived and unnecessary. We should be working together to solve these problems, not engaged in a zero-sum game of political brinksmanship. That's what brought us to where we are today. But I think it's appropriate to look at what Congress did in 1976 and, in a prospective sort of way, ask ourselves, have we delegated too much authority to presidents since that time? There are literally 123 statutory authorizations that can be invoked under the National Emergency Act. 123 times Congress said a president, upon the declaration of a national emergency, can reprogram money that Congress has appropriated. 123 times. That was a shock, not only to me, but I dare say to virtually all of our colleagues here in the Senate. Many of these statutory grants of authority are exceedingly broad and cover everything from the military to public health to federal pay schedules. With these broad authorities already part of the law, the emergency powers provision could be viewed as a fail-safe for an agenda that the administration alone is pushing. Let's say, hypothetically, a future president decides there's a need to declare a national emergency over climate change. Maybe they decide that this is a way to enact the Green New Deal being pushed by some of our colleagues across the aisle. Considering the potential scope and scale in which these powers could be abused in the future, and this over-delegation of authority that Congress has done 123 times, I believe that we should take a look at the National Emergencies Act once we vote today and have a fulsome debate and discussion about whether this is really the sort of delegation of powers that the Founding Fathers intended when they said distinct, separated powers should be given to each branch of the government, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branch. But it's clear that the president is operating within the authority that Congress has given to him. You don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it. But it's clear that the president is operating within the authority Congress delegated to him. Rather than talking in circles and debating that fact, I think our discussion should focus on the structure of emergency powers moving forward. I believe there's a need to rein back in some of the authority that Congress has delegated to presidents, just as an institutional concern, as a constitutional matter, which is why I'm co-sponsoring a bill that's been introduced by our colleague, Senator Lee, which gives Congress a stronger voice in processes under the National Emergencies Act. That bill will now be referred to the Homeland Security Committee. Chairman Johnson has said he will give that bill a hearing and then a markup, and then I would expect that at some point that legislation will make its way to the Senate floor. We'll have a debate and a vote. But the proposal would allow the president to maintain his statutory powers to declare an emergency, but that declaration would end after 30 days unless Congress affirmatively votes to extend it. This would maintain a president's ability to provide funding during national emergencies while restoring Congress's proper authority under Article 1 of the Constitution. I think this is an honest and important effort to hopefully help us prevent us from ending up in this predicament in the future. But the real cause of where we are today, Madam President, is just politics. Ms. Pelosi deciding that building any border barrier was immoral, after Democrats and Republicans had not made that particularly political decision in the past. In fact, it had been bipartisan that we did support as one tool in the toolbox for Border Patrol, in addition to technology and personnel, some physical barriers. So rather than scolding the President of the United States for exercising statutory authority that Congress has already given, we should try to work together to solve these problems rather than engaging in the kind of political brinksmanship that brings us here today. And we should fix, should it be the will of Congress, this delegation, massive delegation of authority, not just to this president, but to any president since 1976. But I have to disagree with our colleague from Colorado and others who suggest that what's happening at the border is not serious. And by the way, I haven't heard any of them suggest any alternative solution. Perhaps instead of Border Patrol securing the border, we ought to have police officers at the border directing traffic, waving people through to their chosen destination. I think that would be a terrible mistake, but that seems to be the only alternative that our friends across the aisle are offering to this humanitarian crisis and emergency at the border. Last month, 76,000 people illegally crossed the border and were apprehended by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, making this an 11-year high. So rather than 76,000 people in 1 month, which our Democratic colleagues don't seem to think is a problem, let's say next month it's 150,000 or 300,000 or 600,000. As long as we have this attraction for people from other countries to come to the United States, and if they pay the fee to the criminal organizations to transport them here, and they will successfully be able to make their way into the United States, they're going to keep coming. It's clear this problem isn't going away, and it's overwhelming the communities along the border as well as the federal government's ability to deal with them. And then I remember what the director of the Customs and Border Protection said. He said, when the Border Patrol is handing out diapers and juice boxes to children coming across the border, the drug cartels will exploit that and move their poison into the United States. I'll just remind my colleagues that more than 70,000 Americans died of drug overdoses last year alone. A substantial amount of it was synthetic opioids in the form of fentanyl, but a lot of it had to do with the heroin that's made its way from Mexico into the United States. 90% of the heroin consumed in the United States comes from Mexico. So while the Border Patrol is handing out diapers and juice boxes, the drug cartels are moving heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine into the United States to its destination and getting rich in the process. Well, we know that border security is complicated, and it's not just about security. It's about facilitating legitimate trade and travel and commerce. Last year alone, there was $300 billion worth of commerce that took place just at Texas ports of entry with Mexico. $300 billion. That supports an awful lot of American jobs. But the terrain in the 1,200-mile border between Texas and Mexico varies significantly. What works well in one sector does not work well in another. And what I continue to hear from my constituents, and including elected officials at the border, that if this is the Border Patrol telling us what they need in order to succeed, to do the job we have asked them to do, we're all in. But if this is just politics and elected officials in Washington trying to micromanage the solution along the border, we're skeptical, is what they tell me, and I don't blame them. So I think we need to take action to adequately fund our border security missions, and I hope our discussions in the coming months will be more productive than they have been so far this year. I will vote against the resolution of disapproval today, and encourage my colleagues to instead focus our energy on reforming the legislation that got us into this situation to begin with.
Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, I'm here this afternoon to support the resolution that would terminate the President's unconstitutional emergency declaration. It's a declaration that would take money from critical military construction projects to fund a costly and ineffective border wall. Congress did not provide these funds for a border wall that President Trump promised Mexico would pay. Rather, we specifically allocated these resources that are being talked about to be used by the President for the wall to ensure that our military is ready and capable and that our service members receive the support they deserve. The President's attempt to circumvent Congress by making the military pay for his border wall jeopardizes our national security and does a disservice to our men and women in uniform. That's why the House passed the legislation on the Senate floor today, and why I introduced legislation with my colleagues in the Senate to terminate the emergency declaration. The resources that Congress has provided support military construction projects in New Hampshire and across the country. Those projects often provide necessary infrastructure improvements that enable our service members to accomplish their mission. Several of those projects that are, I think, potentially being reviewed for adding to the list to take money from are at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. It's one of the many installations that face potential cuts in funding if this emergency declaration is executed. Now, Congress has already approved funding for several projects at the shipyard and at our public shipyards around the country that support critical submarine maintenance, and any disruption to funding of those projects could lead to costly delays and to a reduction in military readiness because they would derail carefully laid plans to upgrade aging infrastructure. And delays in projects that support the shipyard's mission threaten to exacerbate the Navy's already high demand for submarine maintenance and the projected submarine shortfall in the coming years. I recently sent a letter to President Trump and spoke with the leaders at DOD, urging them to protect these important projects at the shipyard. But the only way to ensure that these projects move forward is to terminate the emergency declaration. In addition to projects at the shipyard, the emergency declaration could also impact New Hampshire's National Guard readiness centers, which are in desperate need of modernization. A 2014 report from the Army National Guard ranked the condition of New Hampshire's National Guard facilities 51 out of 54 states and territories. Our National Guard has been forced to shoulder an enormous burden since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Service members have often faced multiple deployments, and they've still had to respond to natural disasters at home and to other personal crises. The New Hampshire National Guard can't afford further delays to the Readiness Center improvements because of President Trump's emergency declaration. These military construction projects in New Hampshire are at risk because President Trump wants to score political points by building a wall rather than focusing on the border security proposals that actually worked. And I was disappointed to hear my colleague from Texas accusing Democrats of not supporting border security, because, in fact, virtually everyone here has supported significant border security proposals in the past, including targeted fencing in vulnerable areas where we know that fencing or barrier can make a difference. We've supported more Border Patrol agents, better surveillance and screening technologies, and increased security at the ports of entry. And coming from a state where we have a huge challenge with the opioid epidemic, where we understand the impact of having cocaine and fentanyl and other drugs come across our border, I also know that the best way to interdict those drugs is through the ports of entry. That's where most of them are coming from. In a recent bipartisan budget agreement, Congress provided, I supported, along with the majority of the Senate, nearly $15 billion for Customs and Border Protection, including $1.3 billion for physical infrastructure in vulnerable areas along the southern border. The reality at our borders is that the vast majority of drugs and contraband come through the ports of entry. They don't come through the areas between the ports of entry. In the past 2 months alone, law enforcement officials have made the largest cocaine seizure in the past 25 years at Newark, New Jersey, and the largest fentanyl seizure ever at any port of entry in the U.S. in Arizona. But despite this reality, President Trump insists on having our military bear the burden to fulfill his campaign promise. And his insistence that the situation at the border requires the military to pay for his wall runs counter to what I've heard in the Senate Armed Services Committee from our military leaders. In a recent Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, General O'Shaughnessy, commander of U.S. Northern Command, testified that the threats to our nation from our southern border are not military in nature, and that he has never advised the President that a border wall is necessary to support his mission. Just this morning, we heard testimony at our SASC hearing with Secretary Shanahan and Joint Chiefs Chairman Dunford that we have more troops on our southern border with Mexico than we have in all of Europe, on our Europe's eastern border with Russia, and we have almost as many on our southern border, a quarter as many as we have on the DMZ on the border with North Korea. Now, by any measure, North Korea and Russia pose a greater threat to our national security than Mexico. It's a policy that does not make sense. Yet we have more troops on the southern border now than we do in Eastern Europe and in Syria. The fact is, the men and women at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and at the New Hampshire National Guard, the men and women who are serving in our military across this country, they should not be forced to sacrifice readiness for an unnecessary border wall that takes funding away from projects that this Congress has already approved that are going forward. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to protect Congress's constitutional authority and defend our national security by supporting the resolution to terminate President Trump's emergency declaration. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
From the outset of this process, I've had two objectives. One, to support the President on the crisis at the border. I believe his plan to address that crisis is a good one. We should support it. But second, to do it in the right way, without setting a dangerous new precedent counter to a fundamental constitutional principle, without tying up the needed funds for the border in the courts, and without taking funds away from important military construction projects for our troops. Unfortunately, despite a sincere effort by the administration, as recently as this morning, to try to work with me and other colleagues, including the presiding officer, we were not able to agree on a path forward that addresses those concerns that I just outlined. I'm going to lay out in a minute how I think we can better achieve the President's goals of strengthening our border security without invoking the national emergency and the funding he seeks through that national emergency. But first, let me repeat what I've said on this floor many times and said consistently. I do believe we have a crisis at the border, a humanitarian crisis, a trafficking crisis, a drug crisis. According to Customs and Border Protection, in February last month, 76,000 illegal immigrants arrived at our southern border. That's an average of about 2,000 every day. Since October of last year, we've apprehended more than 268,000 people at the border. That's about a 100% increase over the same period last year. And we've seen a 300% increase in families arriving at the border compared to this time last year. By the way, the vast majority of those are from 3 countries in Central America. This is a humanitarian crisis. The journey to the United States from these so-called Northern Triangle countries is incredibly dangerous, especially for women and for children. They face violence from gangs and traffickers and hunger and dehydration in the rough terrain. Many of them arrive at our border traumatized, hurt, sick, and often we don't have the resources to provide for those needs. There's also a growing human trafficking crisis. Our lack of border security allows these smugglers, human smugglers, to move across the border unchecked. And increasingly, they're taking advantage of these flows of individuals to traffic women and children. In particular, I will say the Border Patrol resources are spread thin, trying to monitor these areas that do not have barriers. Third, this is a drug crisis. The Drug Enforcement Agency has said the southwest border remains the primary entry point for heroin into the United States. That's not a debatable point. I'm told that with regard to Ohio, where we have been devastated by the opioid epidemic, over 90% of the heroin is coming across the southern border. And fentanyl, the deadliest drug of all, which comes primarily from China and primarily through the U.S. mail system, 50 times more powerful than heroin, is increasingly coming across the southern border, too. Yesterday, I learned from Customs and Border Protection that fentanyl seizures along the border between the ports of entry has increased by 400% between 2016 and 2018. And as we're finally beginning to make progress on the opioid crisis in my home state of Ohio and around the country, finally reducing the number of heroin overdoses and deaths and other opioid, fentanyl, and prescription drug overdose and deaths, for the first time in really 8 years, we're seeing a reduction in those deaths. Crystal meth and the devastation it causes is coming back with a vengeance. It's more pure than ever, more powerful than ever, and it's coming from Mexico. Some of you may remember in your own communities the issue of crystal meth labs being in people's houses and the environmental damage it caused and the crystal meth being cooked. That's not happening much anymore. Why? Because this crystal meth, pure crystal meth from Mexico, is so much more powerful and less expensive. It's cheap. Law enforcement tells me that on the streets of Columbus, Ohio, pure crystal meth is now plentiful and less expensive than marijuana. Far more dangerous. Where's it coming from? It's coming from Mexico. So even with limited resources, in fiscal 2018, Customs and Border Protection seized almost 500,000 pounds of marijuana, 11,000 pounds of methamphetamine between ports of entry. And at the ports of entry, they seized over 1,700 pounds of fentanyl. By the way, that's enough to kill about 3 billion people. 1,700 pounds of fentanyl, 3 flecks of which can kill you. 56,000 pounds of crystal meth, and nearly 52,000 pounds of cocaine. And frankly, that's the tip of the iceberg. Most of it's getting through. They're only checking a small percentage of shipments, meaning the vast majority of drugs is coming across our borders undetected. We need to do more. There's no question we need stronger border security. And again, I support the plan the President has outlined, including the $5.7 billion the President has requested for walls and other barriers. That $5.7 billion number, by the way, it wasn't just picked out of thin air. It funds the top 10 priorities of the Customs and Border Protection Border Security Improvement Plan. The experts have given us a plan, and the President's 5.7 simply funds what the experts have said. This plan, by the way, the Border Security Expert Plan, has been embraced by this Congress in the last 2 appropriations bills. They pointed to that plan and said, this is the path forward. So this is the experts. It's not controversial. By the way, the experts have recommended not that we build a wall from sea to shining sea. It's been mischaracterized at that. But 234 miles of barriers, walls, and other fencing at places where people cross the border most frequently, primarily in the state of Texas, primarily in the urban areas. Places where it'll make the most difference. Funding for these types of barriers has been included in the budget requests from previous administrations, of course. Previous administrations have built hundreds of miles of fencing, over 500 miles. It's also been included in appropriations bills passed by Congress during the last 2 appropriation cycles by both Republicans and Democrats. So why is it that this administration can't build the barriers that other administrations have and that Congress in the past has supported? Of course, it's not just about more physical barriers, and the President's plan also recognizes that. It calls for more Border Patrol agents, more technology, more surveillance, more drones, more cameras, more screening at our ports of entry, more technology to stop this illegal flow of drugs. That's also a significant part of the plan. But erecting more barriers and fencing in key areas along the border will help stem the tide. It will ease the burden on our border security personnel and allow them to focus their resources more effectively. It's time to listen to the experts and give them what they need to carry out their important mission. But we have to do that in the right way. As we all learned in high school, our government has a system of checks and balances. It gives some powers to the President. It gives some powers to Congress. Our Constitution explicitly gives the United States Congress what's called the power of the purse. Congress, not the President, has the sole authority to determine how to spend taxpayer money. And that's appropriate. After all, we're here to represent the people. We're most accountable to the taxpayers. Once we appropriate the money for a specific purpose, then it's the President and the executive branch that's responsible for administering those programs. So we had our spending fight here in Congress. I thought we should give the President the full amount of money he requested for barriers, and I voted that way. At the end of the day, Congress decided to give him only some, not all of the funds he requested. But under current law and current congressional approval and authorities, without declaring a national emergency, President Trump can actually access additional funds that gets him to the $5.7 billion he requested. As the Wall Street Journal said in a recent editorial opposing the national emergency, quote, "The President doesn't need to invoke a national emergency to build his wall along the southern border," end quote. Declaring a national emergency to access different funds sets a dangerous new precedent. The use of national emergency powers to circumvent Congress's explicit decision on funding is unprecedented. No president's ever used what's called the National Emergencies Act in this way. As a result, it opens the door for future presidents to implement just about any policy they want and to take funding from other areas Congress has already decided on without Congress's approval. Once a president declares an emergency, he or she has access to a lot of power. Some would say nearly unlimited power. A future president could seize industries or could control means of communication. Think of the Internet. A future president may well say that climate change is a national emergency and use emergency authorities to implement the Green New Deal. By the way, according to a new study by Douglas Holtz-Eakin at the American Action Forum, the proposed policies in the Green New Deal will cost between $51 trillion and $93 trillion over the next 10 years when added up together. Obviously, that's not sustainable. It's an astounding price tag. In fact, as Senator Alexander said on the floor earlier today, future presidents could actually use this authority, the emergency authority, to tear down the very wall we are now constructing. And some Democrats running for president have said that's what they intend to do. That's what they want to do. So the president is using the National Emergencies Act to take funds away from a particular area of the spending. It's called military construction funds. Only twice before have presidents declared a national emergency in order to transfer military construction funds away from their congressionally designated projects into other priorities. In both of these situations, we were at war, and the Secretary of Defense transferred the funds to support the war effort, and Congress did not object. Although there's a crisis at our southern border, we are not in wartime, and there are funds available to address border security. The President wants to do more to address the crisis at the border, and I do too. And he can do more. The President has available to him enough funds right now to begin building all the barriers he has requested without resorting to national emergency funds. I support him using those funds to get to the full $5.7 billion he requested for barriers on the southern border. Here's how he could access it without using a national emergency. First would be the $1.375 billion that was appropriated by this Congress for the barriers. And by the way, that's the most that's ever been appropriated in a fiscal year ever for the purpose of barriers. Second, he can access, as he intends to do, the $601 million from the Treasury Forfeiture Fund. He can do that without a national emergency. Third, he could access funding through the DoD counter-drug account. Now, he has said he'd like to access about $2.5 billion from that account, but he could actually access, under our laws that we have passed here, we've given him authority to access up to $4 billion. Now, this adds up, as you can see, to over $5.7 billion, almost $6 billion at the President's disposal without moving to the national security, to the national emergency that he has invoked. So my hope is that the President will take this approach. I think using those funds is a better way to accomplish our border security goals. Precisely because the President does not need to declare a national emergency, by the way, these funds are far more certain. The $3.6 billion the President takes from the military construction projects is uncertain because these funds are likely to be tied up in constitutional litigation, tied up for months, probably years. And by the way, the President has rightly acknowledged that. Under the National Emergencies Act, Congress has given the President flexibility to address significant threats to our nation's well-being, and we want him to have that flexibility. It was critical to President Bush to act quickly and decisively in the days after the 9/11 attacks. But short of that type of situation, it's imperative for the President to honor Congress's constitutional role, to make policy and appropriate money. A national emergency declaration is a tool to be used cautiously and sparingly. That's why I've co-sponsored legislation authored by Senator Mike Lee to amend the National Emergencies Act to ensure Congress does have more control over these decisions in the future. So in my view, the best resolution here is for the President to use that nearly $6 billion of funding he has at his disposal to implement his plan and then ask Congress for additional funding during the next appropriation cycle, which, by the way, begins on October 1st of this year. This approach, again, has three distinct advantages. One, it would not set the dangerous precedent we've discussed today. Second, the funds could actually get to the border because they won't be tied up in litigation. And third, it would fully protect important military construction projects in Ohio and around the country, including, by the way, funding for the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, NASIC, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, an automated multi-purpose machine gun range at Camp James A. Garfield, a fire station replacement at Mansfield-Lahm Airport, a small arms range at Rickenbacker International Airport, a small gate relocation project at Youngstown Air Reserve Station. All of those are things that are in the current fiscal year military construction appropriation bill that benefit Ohio. I'm a strong supporter and an advocate for Ohio's military facilities and our research institutions, and will continue to work to ensure that our key military construction projects at these strategic facilities can continue to move forward. I've worked on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. I have the honor of being a senator and a congressman on this side, and I've worked for two White Houses. In fact, I was associate counsel to President Bush 41 in his White House counsel's office. I know how hard it can be for the executive branch, the President, and Congress to find that balance that our founders intended between the executive branch and the legislative branch. But our founders drew a clear line on at least one thing. Congress, closest to the people, would have the power of the purse. When President Obama bypassed Congress and took executive action to create new immigration policy, this was back in 2012, I spoke out. I criticized him because of the constitutionality issue. I said I agreed with President Obama that our immigration system was, and by the way, still is, broken. I agreed we needed to work together to fix it. But I said it doesn't mean that a president can ignore Congress, substitute his own judgment for the will of the people, and make up new laws on his own. That's what I said President Obama did. I believed it was wrong then. I believe the President's use of national emergency declaration to access already approved military construction project funding is wrong now. I support his goals. President Trump is right that we have a crisis, and I support his plan to secure the border. And he can fully fund it in a more reliable way. By the way, anyone who cares about getting that money to the border to build walls ought to want that certainty. Each one of us in this body has sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So today, I will vote to support the disapproval resolution that is before us. I know the President has the votes to pursue his approach. Even if the disapproval resolution passes, he can veto it, and his veto will be sustained. I know that. But I continue to hope the President uses the funds he has available to him without creating a bad precedent, having some of the needed funds tied up in the courts, and taking money from important military projects. President Trump is right about the crisis at the border, and the approach I outlined today would enable him to accomplish his policy objectives on the border and honor our Constitution. I yield back my time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in strong opposition to President Trump's so-called emergency declaration of a crisis and invasion on our southern border, an attempt to misappropriate funds to build the president's border wall. The president's actions